What happens when an empire with 1,000,000 men walks blindly into a mountain pass thinking victory is already theirs? The wind howled through the cliffs of Thermopylae, carrying the scent of salt, sweat, and silence. On one side, the most feared army on earth, the vast and glittering machine of Persia. On the other, a few thousand Greeks, their armor dulled by dust, their eyes hardened by fate. And at the center, standing tall, not just in rank, but in spirit, was Leonidas, a king with no illusion of survival, but a vision of legacy. In less than 2 minutes, you're going to see how ego brought the world's largest army to its knees, and how one king turned a hopeless stand into a masterpiece of tactical defiance. Now let's pull back the curtain. This isn't just a story of swords clashing in a narrow pass. It's a psychological war, a clash of egos, cultures, and ideologies. Xerxes, the king of kings, didn't just come for conquest. He came for dominance, submission, a statement. And that was his first mistake. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be defeated in 100 battles. Sun Tzu. But Xerxes knew neither. Blinded by his own power, his vision narrowed, ironically, just like the pass he was about to march into. He believed numbers alone would dictate victory, that sheer volume would crush resistance, that intimidation would replace strategy. But war, as every seasoned general knows, is never just about numbers. It's about position, will, timing, terrain, and above all, understanding the enemy. Leonidas understood that. Not just the terrain, which he mastered, but the psychology. He knew the Persians expected collapse. He knew they thought fear would unravel the Greeks before the first arrow flew. Instead, Leonidas gave them something else: silence, discipline, and a calm that shook even the most seasoned enemy commanders. Imagine that, being one of Xerxes' scouts, looking down into that narrow strip of death between mountain and sea, seeing not chaos, but calm formation, not fear, but readiness. Phalanx shields interlocked like iron jaws waiting to bite. It wasn't bravado, it was preparation. Leonidas wasn't betting on miracles. He was betting on friction, on the reality that giant machines fall apart when they underestimate small stones. And here's the thing most forget. Xerxes had warnings. His advisors knew the terrain. Some of his generals raised doubts. But overconfidence acts like fog. It blurs vision, muffles logic. War is the realm of uncertainty, wrote Clausewitz centuries later, and 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty. That fog had already rolled into Xerxes' command tent long before the first spear was thrown. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Leonidas knew exactly what was coming. He chose his 300 not just for skill, but for spirit. Men with sons, heirs, ready to die without extinguishing their bloodline. That's not just strategy, that's legacy planning, a concept Persia, with all its grandeur, couldn't comprehend. The pass at Thermopylae wasn't just narrow, it was surgical. It forced Persia to fight on Greek terms. All that cavalry? Useless. All those archers? Limited. All that size? Bottlenecked into futility. Leonidas wasn't hoping to win. He was hoping to prove a point. And that's what made the Persian Empire tremble. So the question is, how did the most powerful empire of the ancient world walk straight into a tactical trap? set by a man already preparing to die? What you're about to witness is not just a battle, it's a masterclass in restraint, deception, and resolve. The kind of battle where morale weighs more than metal, and where a single choke point becomes a symbol for eternity. Because what Persia didn't see was the psychological warfare already unfolding long before their boots hit Greek soil. And what you're about to see is how Leonidas, king of a city smaller than one of Xerxes' provinces, weaponized terrain, discipline, and death itself, and in doing so, rewrote the very meaning of resistance. But the real trap? It wasn't the cliffs. They believed it would be a formality for the mighty Persian Empire, an empire sprawling across continents and stitched together by gold, fear, and ambition. Thermopylae was supposed to be a brief interruption, a scenic detour, one more line to cross before Athens bowed. But history doesn't smile kindly on those who confuse confidence with clarity. Xerxes, heir to a legacy of expansion, marched not just with men, but with the weight of expectation. His army wasn't merely large, it was colossal, a living tide of warriors, horses, engineers, and servants that devoured miles like fire through dry grass. To those in his court, it felt like destiny. To those in his path, it felt like doom. Yet even the largest army can trip over a single unseen step. For all his power, Xerxes lacked one thing: doubt, the kind of doubt that sharpens plans and humbles decisions. He assumed the Greeks would fold, that fear would outrun resistance, that no sane man would stand firm against the shadow of 1,000,000 spears. But he never paused to ask what if they did. Centuries before, a Chinese general left behind a warning: if you misread your enemy, you've already lost. Xerxes didn't hear it, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. That's the danger of hearing only what confirms your plans. So he marched forward, certain, impatient, and completely blind to the storm waiting in that narrow pass between sea and stone. And that pass, it wasn't chosen by accident. It wasn't some last resort. It was bait. Leonidas understood something that eluded his rival. He knew where power could be neutralized, where tight spaces canceled out vast numbers. Thermopylae wasn't a gamble, it was a lever, one perfectly placed to break the illusion of Persian invincibility. But Xerxes couldn't see it. He didn't believe that a few thousand men could disrupt his empire's rhythm, that a sliver of rocky coastline could become a wall. He imagined a show of strength would do the work before steel ever touched skin, that the very sight of his army would drain the fight from Greek hearts. What he didn't understand is this: when people fight for survival, the rules of war change. Pride and discipline fuse into something far more dangerous: conviction. That's what Leonidas brought to Thermopylae. Not just bodies, not just armor, but belief, raw and unshakable, and not belief in victory necessarily, but in meaning, in dying for something that would echo longer than any crown ever could. He wasn't some distant, armored monarch. He led from the dust, slept where his men slept, fought in the front, not the rear, and when the moment came to make his stand, he didn't roar, he didn't need to. His calm was command, his silence, strategy. What makes this story endure isn't just the blood spilled on those rocks, it's the clarity with which two worlds collided, one bloated with certainty, the other sharpened by necessity. The Persians, for all their numbers, weren't unified in mind. Their empire was stitched with fear, not loyalty. Their generals disagreed, their maps lied. Their momentum, so powerful from afar, slowed to a crawl the moment real resistance appeared. And that resistance? It held. Because while Xerxes tried to bury the Greeks with numbers, he forgot that some walls are built not with stones, but with will. Clausewitz once hinted that battles are decided not just by plans or firepower, but by the unpredictable forces that live in the minds of men. The doubts, the courage, the stubborn refusal to fall. Xerxes had none of that in his calculations, and that omission cost him dearly. So when people say that Thermopylae was a lost cause, they miss the point. Leonidas didn't stand there to win. He stood to warn, to delay, to show every Greek city that unity was possible, that resistance wasn't madness, it was duty, that even when death was certain, dignity was not negotiable. And Xerxes, he saw it too late, because what he believed would be a quick display of power became a quagmire, a humiliation, and a signal to every rebel, rival, and reluctant ally that the Persian war machine could be stopped. It started with arrogance, but what unfolded was something else entirely. And in the heart of that narrow pass, Xerxes learned, too late, that sometimes the smaller force doesn't break, it becomes the story. The pass was no accident. If you walk Thermopylae today, the ground has shifted. The sea is farther out, the cliffs softened by time. But in 480 before Christ, it was different. The path between the mountains and the Malian Gulf was barely wide enough for a cart. It twisted, narrowed, and gave no room for flanks. That wasn't just geography, that was strategy, sharpened to a blade. Leonidas saw what others missed. Terrain could be a weapon. Not a single Spartan expected to survive. That wasn't the mission. The mission was delay. And to delay an army the size of Persia's, you needed more than courage. You needed the earth itself to fight alongside you. And that's exactly what Leonidas turned it into. There's a saying in warfare, one echoed by Clausewitz himself: everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. Knowing the enemy is strong is simple. Using the terrain to erase that strength, that's difficult. That's genius. That's Thermopylae. Most commanders in Leonidas's place would have retreated to higher ground, maybe tried guerrilla raids, avoided open confrontation. But Leonidas wasn't playing for territory. He was playing for message, for momentum, for time. He chose Thermopylae because it was a natural funnel, a place where numbers couldn't matter, where 100 men had the same impact as 1,000 if they stood their ground. It was one of the rare points in all of Greece where the battlefield could be tamed, predictable, controlled. And in a war where Persia controlled everything else, sea, sky, supply, this control mattered more than any spear. Now picture this, 1,000 Persian archers preparing to fire. In an open plain, it would be a massacre. But in that pass, their arcs were useless, their volleys broken against rock walls. No room to scatter, no space to breathe. And when the Persian infantry moved forward, shoulder to shoulder, they didn't find disorganized rebels. They found a wall. The Spartan phalanx wasn't just a formation. It was trust, forged in fire. Shields locked so tight that even breath had to be synchronized. Every man knew the rhythm, knew the sounds, knew what it meant to hold and when to strike. The narrowness of the pass didn't just help the Spartans, it punished the Persians. Their elite forces, the Immortals, were trained to overwhelm with flow and movement. But here, movement was death. Each step had to be earned, and every inch gained came at the price of blood. This was Leonidas's gamble, a slow grind, a drawn-out bleed of morale, resources, and confidence, because he understood something the generals often forget. Not every battle needs to be won in order to be won. And it wasn't just Spartans out there, Thespians, Thebans, a handful of Greeks who chose resistance over silence. Leonidas turned that rocky pass into a crucible, into a place where loyalty was tested and fear had no room to grow. What made it work wasn't just the terrain, it was the mindset. Spartans were taught from birth that pain was instruction, that death wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Dishonor was. And in that brutal calculation, the pass became more than a tactic. It became a mirror, reflecting Persian arrogance back at them, one failed charge at a time. Psychologically, it was devastating. Xerxes watched as elite units were shattered, as commanders failed, as morale eroded. How could so few do so much damage? Because Leonidas didn't just block the road, he rewrote the rules of engagement. He made Persia come to him. He turned geography into a silent ally. Every cliff a barrier, every stone a position, every drop of blood a delay. And with each delay, the message grew louder. We will not move. Overy once wrote that morale often decides more battles than weapons. Here, it was visible, tangible. Every moment the Spartans stood their ground. They weren't just buying time. They were reshaping the narrative, making sure the world remembered who they were, not through speeches or scrolls, but by holding a pass no one thought could be held. And when we talk about military brilliance, we often think of grand maneuvers, sweeping attacks. But Leonidas, he did the opposite. He stood still and let the empire break upon him. Because in war, movement isn't always power. Sometimes standing still changes everything. How much is a man willing to give when he knows he won't live to see the reward? That question didn't hang in the air at Thermopylae. It burned in every breath, pounded in every heartbeat. Because those men, led by Leonidas, weren't fighting to win in the traditional sense. They were fighting to mean something. And that changes everything. To the Persians, it looked like madness. A few thousand men against the full force of an empire. To fight was suicide. To stay was foolishness. But the Spartans weren't guided by fear. They were guided by a different kind of logic, one not written in scrolls or mapped out on parchment. It lived in the soul. Honor, for them, was not a decoration. It was currency. The only thing that mattered when your body was broken and your sword was gone. It was what you passed down when you had nothing else left to give. And at Thermopylae, it was everywhere. But honor doesn't just happen. It's shaped, sharpened, hardened. Spartans were raised to believe that death in battle wasn't the end. It was the pinnacle, a final act of purpose. And when that belief is shared by every man in the line, something remarkable happens. Fear retreats, doubt fades. The line doesn't break because there's no weight left to crush it. Victor Davis Hanson captured it best when he said, "The psychology of defense often outweighs raw numbers." That's what made Thermopylae more than a clash of armies. It was a duel of mindsets, of what men believed about themselves, their homes, their cause. And Persia believed numbers would crush will. But morale isn't something you measure in columns and formations. It's invisible. Until it isn't. Until it stands in front of you, unmoving, unshaken, staring you down from behind a wall of bronze. Here's what few talk about. The exhaustion, the mental cost, day after day of holding the line, watching friends fall, listening to the cries of the wounded, the knowledge that no reinforcements were coming, that even if you succeeded, you wouldn't survive it. And yet they stayed. Why? Because that stand wasn't just about defending a pass. It was about defending an idea that some things are worth more than breath. That morale, when rooted deep enough, becomes armor you can't pierce. The Spartans weren't just resisting an army, they were resisting erasure, the loss of their way of life, their beliefs, their identity. The Persians didn't understand that, not at first. They thought fear would eventually win, that hunger, heat, and the sheer grind of it all would wear the Greeks down. And to be fair, those things can break a man, but not when the cause is bigger than the man. Spartans believed they were already dead the moment they marched, that death was coming, and the only thing left to decide was how they'd greet it. And that belief? It's contagious. Even among allies, even among men who didn't grow up in Sparta, who hadn't trained since boyhood to endure pain. At Thermopylae, it didn't matter. Because once you stand shoulder to shoulder with someone who treats fear like a ghost, you begin to believe in something larger than survival. That's the true battlefield most people miss. It's not just the one filled with swords and arrows, it's the one inside, the one where morale and despair fight in silence. And here's the twist. The Persians were the ones who began to crack. They saw their elite units pushed back. They saw their dead pile up in a space too small to bury them all. They felt something they hadn't expected to feel in Greece: hesitation. The longer the Spartans held, the louder the unspoken question grew. Why haven't they fallen yet? And that question eats at confidence, undermines certainty, turns strength into noise. Because the most dangerous thing you can give your enemy is time to believe. Beaver once said, "Psychological collapse is often the precursor to physical defeat." At Thermopylae, it didn't happen in full, but the seeds were planted. The mighty army began to question itself, its leaders, its assumptions. Meanwhile, Leonidas's men weren't just enduring. They were defining the terms of their own defeat, defining what it meant to stand when standing seemed impossible, defining what generations would later call courage, but what in the moment was simply duty. And that's what made Thermopylae a battlefield unlike any other. It wasn't just about strategy or weapons or terrain. It was about spirit, the kind that doesn't yield, the kind that makes even death feel like a form of victory. And that kind of spirit doesn't fade. Let's talk about size, because for Persia, size was the strategy. Xerxes didn't just bring an army, he brought an empire on the march. Roads were built just to carry it, bridges engineered to hold the weight of men, horses, siege equipment, supplies. When he looked west, toward Greece, he didn't see a battlefield. He saw a formality, a route to domination paved by sheer presence. But here's the flaw in that thinking. The bigger the machine, the more fragile it becomes when the smallest gears fail. And fail they did. The first cracks weren't dramatic, they rarely are. They came quietly. Murmurs among quartermasters, delays in supply convoys, misread terrain reports. But that's the nature of friction, as Clausewitz described it. War isn't fought in theory. It's fought in the mud, in hunger, in confusion. And the Persians, despite their grandeur, were just as vulnerable to it as anyone else. Overextension was the first real wound. Persia's lines stretched back for hundreds of miles. Each advance deep into Greece meant another strain on resources. Imagine trying to feed a force so large it consumed the countryside like locusts. Every step forward required a leap of logistics behind it. And Thermopylae? It wasn't just a pass. It was a choke in every sense of the word, not just for soldiers, but for wagons, horses, messengers. The terrain didn't scale with the army. It punished it. It narrowed everything. And in doing so, it amplified every mistake. Now, add another layer: rigidity in command. Persian warfare thrived on structure. Orders moved top-down. Dissent was dangerous. But in an environment like Thermopylae, where fast adaptation was the difference between progress and disaster, that structure became a trap. The Greeks shifted, adjusted, responded. The Persians repeated until repetition became weakness. They had elite forces, the immortals, feared across the known world. But fear alone doesn't win battles, especially not when those elite forces are thrown into a situation where their advantages vanish. The narrow pass stripped away the elegance of Persian formations, their strength in mobility, in encirclement, in overwhelming numbers, all gone in the squeeze of geography. And while the front lines struggled, the high command grew divided. Xerxes, surrounded by advisors, faced a problem he hadn't prepared for: failure. Days passed, losses mounted, and every failed charge chipped away at the illusion of control. Some commanders urged caution, others demanded escalation, but consensus, that was rare and costly. Here's where it gets even sharper. The terrain, yes, it was narrow, but Persia's scouts should have known that. They had months to prepare, time to assess, and yet they dismissed it, assumed it would be irrelevant. That miscalculation didn't just slow them down, it transformed Thermopylae into a graveyard for assumptions. And while Persia scrambled, the Spartans held. Because they didn't have to do anything fancy. They just had to endure, which ironically made them more agile than their enemies. That's the paradox Xerxes never grasped. The side with less room to move was moving smarter. Let's return to Clausewitz for a moment. He spoke of friction as the unpredictable chaos that turns plans to dust. That's what was happening here. Not in one big moment, but in dozens of small ones. Delays, wrong turns, missed signals, commanders talking past each other, terrain that refused to cooperate. All of it added up. And when you add that to the sheer psychological weight of watching your best troops fall again and again in the same patch of land, it starts to rot the core of confidence. Because numbers don't fight. People do. And people, no matter how many you have, don't perform well when their expectations are broken and their leaders have no answers. The brilliance of the Greek defense wasn't just in resistance. It was in how it exposed every blind spot in Persian planning, every shortcut they tried to take, every assumption they leaned on. Thermopylae wasn't just a pass. It was a trap, not just of rock and spear, but of logic. And Xerxes, for all his might, walked right into it convinced that size was destiny. But in war, destiny has a sense of irony. And sometimes the greatest threat to an empire is its own overconfidence. The Spartans didn't come to Thermopylae to improvise. They came with a plan, simple in design, brutal in execution, and every part of it, from the placement of their feet to the angle of their shields, was tailored to one goal: hold the line. But here's the beauty of it. Their plan wasn't built on flair or unpredictability. It was built on discipline. And in the chaos of war, Nothing is more dangerous than a soldier who does exactly what he's trained to do, every single time, without hesitation. The phalanx. It sounds like just another formation until you see it in motion. Rows of men, shields overlapping, spears thrust forward in perfect unison. To break it, you didn't just have to push hard, you had to outthink it, disrupt it, make it flinch. And the Spartans didn't flinch. They moved like a single organism, not because they were told to, but because they were molded to. Trained from childhood to breathe as one, strike as one, stand as one. It wasn't instinct, it was muscle memory, honed in the dust of training grounds and the silence of pain endured. Now put that kind of precision inside a pass where chaos can't spread wide, where waves of Persian soldiers have no room to flank, no space to surround. Suddenly, the Spartan line doesn't just hold, it dominates. That's where their mastery really shined. Because most armies rely on space to win, room to move, to adjust, to flow around obstacles. But Leonidas and his men didn't need space. They thrived in its absence. The tighter it got, the more lethal they became. And it wasn't just about their shields or spears. It was about their presence, the way they stood, silent, still, waiting. Psychological warfare at its purest. They didn't need to taunt or shout. Just standing there, unmoving, unreadable, was enough to shake even seasoned warriors. There's something terrifying about fighting someone who doesn't react the way you expect. Imagine charging at a wall of shields, knowing you outnumber them 100 to 1, and they don't budge. You hear your comrade scream, you push harder, and still nothing. No break, no fear, just that same cold, perfect line. That's what the Persians faced, day after day. And leading that wall, Leonidas. He didn't direct from a hilltop. He didn't ride behind the lines. He was there, at the front, shield locked with the rest, eyes forward, breath steady. That kind of leadership doesn't need words. It radiates, and every man behind him felt it. Overy once wrote, "Morale often determines the outcome more than men or weapons." At Thermopylae, it wasn't a theory. It was the battlefield itself. Spartan morale wasn't just high, it was immovable. And that morale fed into their tactics, into their timing, into the way they rotated fresh fighters to the front line while others caught their breath. Even their fatigue was organized. And that's what made the difference. While Persian soldiers charged with fury, Spartans responded with calculation. While the invaders sought to overwhelm, the defenders focused on rhythm, on tempo, on making every strike count, every block mean something. And they did it all while outnumbered. Because here's the thing, being outnumbered only matters if you let it matter, and the Spartans never did. They made the battlefield small, mentally, physically, tactically. They turned the pass into a blade and invited Persia to bleed on it. And Persia did, over and over. Every failure chipped away at the illusion of Persian invincibility, and every success, however small, reminded the Greek allies that resistance wasn't just symbolic, it was effective. Leonidas didn't just command a defense, he staged a lesson. That strength isn't just numbers, it's repetition, consistency, unyielding will sharpened by time and bonded by belief. And at Thermopylae, that will wasn't hidden. It stood in formation, day after day, shield to shield, asking one silent question. How many more are you willing to lose to move one step forward? There's a side of war that maps don't show. You won't see it in diagrams or casualty charts, but it's there, alive in the hearts of the men standing in the dust, staring down death. Thermopylae was many things: a strategic defense, a physical blockade, a political message. But at its core, it was a battle for the mind. And in that battle, the Spartans held more than just a pass. They held control over fear. Honor in Sparta wasn't just cultural. It was coded deep into the bones of its warriors. From childhood, boys were trained not just to fight, but to master themselves. Hunger, pain, humiliation, all part of the training. So when the moment came to die, it wasn't shocking. It was expected, embraced even. But honor isn't about theatrics. It's quiet, it's personal, and it carries a weight. Imagine knowing that no reinforcements are coming, that your name might be forgotten, that your family will never see you again, and still you stand. Not because of pride, but because turning away would stain everything you've ever believed in. That was the mental terrain Leonidas and his men navigated every day, every breath. Now flip that perspective. Imagine you're a Persian foot soldier. You've crossed deserts, climbed mountains, marched behind the banners of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. You've been told this campaign is unstoppable. And then, in a thin pass between cliff and sea, you see it halted, not by an army, but by a few hundred men who refuse to move, who seem immune to fear, who die without retreating. What does that do to you? It starts small, a whisper in the back of your mind. Why are they still fighting? Why haven't they fallen? And that whisper grows. It spreads. It turns strength into unease, confidence into doubt. That's the battlefield we rarely talk about, the one no sword can conquer. And this was where the Spartans truly excelled. They didn't just endure physically, they dominated psychologically. They made themselves the immovable object, not just in stance, but in presence. The way they looked, the way they moved, the way they didn't react, all of it sent a message: you cannot break us. Persian commanders tried to shift tactics, increase pressure, rotate fresh units into the fight, but none of it cracked the Spartan wall, and that started to shake the foundation of Persian morale. Because when fear starts creeping in, it doesn't ask permission. You begin to notice things: the weight of your armor, the sound of your own breathing, the way your commander avoids your eyes. And suddenly, it's not about orders anymore, it's about survival. And yet, for the Spartans, survival was never the goal. Their power came from having already let go of life. They didn't fear death, they feared dishonor. And that flipped the rules. That turned Thermopylae into a mirror, forcing every Persian soldier to ask, "Why am I here?" Some couldn't answer that question. Beaver once said, psychological collapse is often the precursor to physical defeat. And that's what we see forming in these early days. Not a rout, not a surrender, but cracks, silent, creeping cracks in an army that thought it was unbreakable. The Spartans didn't shout victory, they whispered pressure. And in doing so, they rewrote what it meant to hold the line. Because holding, in this case, wasn't just about resisting force, it was about owning the mind of the enemy. And in that arena, the one unseen by most, the Leonidas and his warriors were already winning. You can have the largest army in the world, but if you don't know where you're stepping, you're not advancing, you're walking blind. And that's exactly what happened to Xerxes at Thermopylae. It's easy to assume the Persians had eyes everywhere, that with their wealth and reach, they'd mastered the art of intelligence. But beneath the gold and grandeur was something far more fragile: assumption. And assumption is the enemy of strategy. The first and most obvious failure? Terrain awareness. This wasn't some hidden valley. Thermopylae had been known for centuries. Its narrow path, its natural bottleneck, its history as a defensive choke point. And yet when Xerxes marched west, he underestimated it. Not just the physical layout, but what it meant strategically. He didn't send engineers ahead to adapt the terrain. He didn't listen to local informants who warned of its constraints. He expected the same open field results he'd enjoyed elsewhere. But Thermopylae doesn't reward laziness. It punishes overreach. And the punishment began before a single blade was drawn. Because the Greek forces, led by men like Leonidas, knew every inch of that ground. They didn't need to guess. They'd trained for it. They used locals, shepherds, traders, eyes who knew where the rock broke, where water pooled, where a man could disappear with a message and reappear behind enemy lines. The Spartans weren't just brave, they were informed. Meanwhile, Persia's intelligence network failed to deliver. Their scouts missed critical elevation points, their advisors downplayed Greek cohesion, and their interpreters, often unfamiliar with the mountain dialects, misread both tone and message. That blindness cost lives. But more than that, it cost time, and time in a war like this isn't neutral. It favors the side that uses it best. The Greeks knew that. Every delay meant more preparation for allies further south, more whispers of resistance spreading across city-states, more doubt brewing in the Persian command. And still, Xerxes dismissed the warnings. One story tells of a Greek who defected, attempting to explain the pass, how narrow it truly was, how impossible it would be to break without overwhelming loss. Xerxes ignored him. Arrogance again, wearing the mask of strategy. But let's not pretend Persia lacked skill. They had some of the sharpest minds of the age. The problem was direction. You can't make good use of information if you won't accept it. And in Thermopylae, the truth was inconvenient. Because the truth said, you can't just march through this. And then came the silence. That eerie stillness when your forces are supposed to be moving forward, and instead, they stall. Scouts report the same result. No breach, no collapse, no opening. And the more you ask, the fewer answers you get. Xerxes' frustration grew not because he lacked power, but because he lacked clarity. His messages had to travel miles, often through foreign tongues. By the time orders reached the front, they were outdated. And when new reports came in, they contradicted what he'd been told days before. It wasn't chaos. It was worse. It was misalignment. One moment in particular stands out. The Immortals, Persia's elite, were sent in under the cover of darkness, quiet, efficient, ruthless. But they walked into a trap because the Greeks had predicted it. The narrow pass neutralized their advantage. They couldn't fan out, they couldn't surprise, and they were cut down methodically. That kind of intelligence gap doesn't just wound an army, it drains it. Because when your best trained soldiers fail in silence, you start to question everything. The maps, the terrain, the very decisions that got you here. And Xerxes, who believed victory would come with certainty, now stood in a place of growing doubt. Sun Tzu once wrote, "All warfare is based on deception." The Greeks didn't have to lie. They just had to let Persian confidence walk ahead of reality. And when it did, they closed the door behind it. At Thermopylae, the real battle began long before the clash of metal. It began in what Persia didn't know and what it refused to learn. It's not always an army that turns the tide. Sometimes it's a whisper in the wrong ear. For 2 full days, the pass at Thermopylae held. Spears clashed, shields groaned. The line bent, but it never broke. Persia, despite its might, had been stalled by grit and granite. Then came the betrayal. His name was Ephialtes, a man of the land, a local who knew the cliffs, the trails, the hidden veins of the mountain like a hunter knows the breath of his prey. And for reasons that still stir anger centuries later, whether for reward, revenge, or fear, he showed the Persians a secret path. It wasn't wide, it wasn't fast, but it bypassed the wall. It reached the back of the Greek position, and just like that, the shape of the battle changed. This wasn't a battlefield anymore, it was a trap. But now the trap was closing on the ones who built it. Word of the encirclement reached Leonidas not as a thunderclap, but a shadow, a ripple of truth carried on the lips of scouts and allies. The Persians were coming, not just from the front, from behind, from above. And here's where the story turns not into tragedy, but into legend. Leonidas didn't flee. He didn't order a full retreat. He released the bulk of the Allied forces, yes, but he stayed alongside his Spartans, alongside a few hundred others who chose to remain. Because for them, the battle had never been about survival. It was about statement. And this was the loudest one they could make. Imagine the weight of that decision, knowing that in a few hours you will be surrounded, that no path leads to victory, that every breath you take is one step closer to death. And still, you plant your feet, you lock your shield, you look your brothers in the eye and nod, not with fear, but with resolve. That's not despair, that's defiance. Persia, for all its power, didn't expect this. Encirclement was meant to be a finishing blow, a psychological collapse. But instead of watching the Greeks scatter, they watched them brace, tighten, ready themselves for the final wave. And here's the brutal irony. The encirclement cost Persia more than it gained, because it exposed their desperation. Xerxes didn't win the pass, he bought it. With betrayal, with indirect paths, with maneuvers he'd dismissed days earlier. And in doing so, he handed Leonidas the very thing the Spartans valued most: clarity. No more waiting, no more suspense, just the final stand. That morning, the Greeks formed up for the last time. No reinforcements, no escape. Just shields, spears, and the silence of acceptance. The Persian forces, emboldened by the coming closure, advanced with fury. But what they meant wasn't panic, it was thunder. A final roar of resistance. Spears breaking, swords drawn, fists clenched. The kind of fight that isn't tactical, but primal, human. Even as the line shrank, the story grew. Lee Dalhart once said, "An indirect approach can break the strongest defense." And yes, it did. But what it didn't break was the will behind it. Because sometimes the measure of victory isn't in who stands last, but in what message remains long after the field has cleared. And Leonidas? His message echoes still. That in the face of betrayal, you can still choose where and how you fall.
What lasts longer than a battle, longer than empire? Ideas. And Thermopylae, for all its loss and blood, became an idea that outlived every man who stood in that pass. It outlived Persia, outlived Sparta, outlived the century itself. Because what happened there didn't just change the course of the Greco-Persian wars, it rewrote how armies understood defense. Let's start with the obvious: terrain. After Thermopylae, no serious military mind could look at a narrow pass or mountain trail the same way. It wasn't just geography, it was opportunity. A way for smaller forces to punch above their weight, to reshape the battlefield into something they could control. Defensive warfare gained new respect. The idea that a well-disciplined, strategically positioned force could delay or damage a superior opponent became part of military thinking for centuries. From Roman legions building temporary fortifications to modern commanders choosing choke points in urban warfare. It all echoes back to that rocky strip of land in northern Greece. But here's the twist. Thermopylae also became myth. And myths, when not checked, blur the lines between inspiration and illusion. Some believed the Spartans won, others believed they never meant to. And somewhere in that fog, the lessons of strategy risked being drowned in the poetry of sacrifice. That's why the historical dissection matters. Because behind the legend is something cold, clear, and incredibly sharp. A doctrine of measured defiance, of turning weakness into leverage, of knowing when to hold and knowing what that hold can buy. Thermopylae wasn't just about fighting well, it was about timing, buying days, creating space for allies to rally, giving Athens time to prepare its navy, giving the Greek city-states time to realize that unity was possible because someone proved it with their lives. And that's a kind of strategy not taught in numbers, but in will. Now let's bring in two contrasting voices, Grant and Leonidas. Grant was a man of attrition. He understood patience, that sometimes you bleed the enemy until their will gives out. Leonidas, he understood urgency, that sometimes time itself is the objective. You don't wait, you act. And in doing so, you force history to accelerate. Both knew something essential, that success isn't always measured in land gained or enemies killed. Sometimes it's measured in what you prevent. At Thermopylae, what was prevented wasn't just the Persian advance. It was the collapse of resistance across Greece, the psychological implosion that could have followed if no one had stood up and said, "Here, no further." And that's why the battle lives on, because it reminds commanders, ancient and modern, that the fight is never just about bodies, it's about symbols. And symbols, when chosen wisely, become weapons of their own. Even today, the lessons of Thermopylae are dissected in military academies, not because of the outcome, but because of the intent, the clarity of purpose, the surgical use of terrain, morale, and sacrifice to delay the inevitable, and in doing so, change it. And as the years passed, every general who faced overwhelming odds thought, if only for a moment, about that narrow pass, about the king who chose to stay, and about what kind of victory can be carved from a place designed to crush hope. That's the legacy. A defense that became a doctrine, a last stand that became a first spark. Armies don't move on glory, they move on grain. And when the supply line breaks, even the greatest force in the world becomes just a crowd of exhausted, starving men carrying weapons they can barely lift. That was the quiet danger that stalked the Persian army long before they reached Thermopylae. It started as a whisper, an overextended wagon train here, a delayed shipment there, but it grew, because Persia's strength was also its curse, scale.
The same vastness that made the empire seem unstoppable made it incredibly fragile when stretched too far, too fast. Xerxes brought an army so large it drank rivers dry. Whole regions were tasked with feeding the march. And in theory, it all looked manageable. On paper, the caravans would arrive, the stores would be full, the men would eat, rest, fight. But theory collapses when the road does. Thermopylae wasn't just a bottleneck for warriors, it was a chokehold on logistics. The terrain slowed carts, the narrow passes forced long, winding queues. Communication between the front and rear became guesswork. And when you're feeding tens of thousands, guesswork kills. The Greeks understood this better than anyone. While Leonidas held the front, Greek partisans struck the rear. Small bands, quick raids, burning supplies, blocking paths, terrorizing couriers. They didn't need to win in battle. They just needed to keep the blood from reaching the heart. And that's what logistics is. It's the blood of the campaign. Glantz once wrote, "Logistics is the lifeblood of any campaign." And in Thermopylae, that lifeblood began to clot. You won't find heroic poems about broken wheels or missing mules, but they matter because when soldiers go hungry, they don't fight, they wait. And waiting under pressure, that breeds frustration, fracture, fear. It also breeds disease. With limited access to fresh supplies, hygiene plummeted. Food spoiled faster in the summer heat. Clean water grew scarce, and the Persian army, which once felt like a rolling tide, began to feel like a machine overheating from within. And let's not forget the psychological weight. Imagine watching your rations shrink as your commander insists that victory is just over the ridge. Watching your comrades fight not just Spartans, but fatigue, heat stroke, sickness. The enemy becomes abstract, the hardship becomes immediate. The Greeks, on the other hand, needed very little. They fought where they trained, ate little, slept little, expected less. Their resilience wasn't just physical, it was logistical. They could survive off the land, off discipline, off habit. Persia couldn't. Persia needed comfort to maintain cohesion, and Thermopylae stripped that comfort away, inch by inch. Every missed shipment, every burnt cart, every misplaced barrel of grain chipped away at Persian strength. Not visibly, not at all at once, but like erosion, slow, steady, relentless. And while the front line roared with battle cries, the back of the army echoed with sighs, with grumbling, with men asking quietly how long this could continue. The truth is, Persia didn't lose Thermopylae because of one bad choice. It lost it in pieces, in the food that didn't arrive, in the maps that didn't match the land, in the stomachs that turned before the swords ever did. That's the war behind the war. And at Thermopylae, it was just as brutal, just as decisive, just a lot quieter. War doesn't care about forecasts, but sometimes the wind changes everything. At Thermopylae, the battle wasn't just between men, it was also between them and the land had already chosen its side. From the very start, the geography had shaped the strategy, but it was the environment, the unpredictable, the untamed, that shaped the rhythm of the fight. The pass itself, narrow and uneven, didn't just restrict movement, it concentrated it, funneled bodies and chaos into a place too tight for tactics that relied on open space. The Spartans understood this. They didn't just position themselves there, they bonded with it, became part of the terrain, and in doing so, they made nature their ally. Now add in the weather. The summer heat, the dense, unrelenting air, the kind that makes armor feel like it weighs twice as much, that steals water from your body faster than you can drink it. For the Persians, many of whom had marched from cooler highlands or distant eastern provinces, it was suffocating. Heat breaks discipline, it slows reflexes, it dulls the edge of not of blades, but of minds. And yet the Spartans endured. Because this wasn't discomfort for them, it was training. They were raised on pain, conditioned to suffer, and in moments when others looked to shade or rest, they looked to the enemy and moved. But it wasn't just heat. Storms rolled in from the coast, sudden, sharp, soaking armor, turning dust to sludge, wetting the terrain just enough to make footing uncertain. These weren't dramatic floods or cinematic tempests, just enough disruption to make every charge a gamble. The Greeks used that. They timed their positioning, adjusted their grip, let the environment slow the Persians while they stood firm, boots dug into familiar ground. And there's something deeper here. Because while weather is often seen as neutral, at Thermopylae it wasn't. It played favorites. Every gust of sea wind blowing into Persian faces, every glare of sun bouncing off bronze shields, every drop of rain that muddied the slopes they tried to climb, it all whispered the same truth. You don't belong here. That psychological edge mattered. Because soldiers don't just fight other soldiers, they fight their own doubt. And when the earth seems to favor the enemy, that doubt grows. Clausewitz once said, "No campaign can succeed without mastering the environment." Thermopylae proved that you don't just master the environment by studying it, you master it by becoming part of it. That's what Leonidas did. He didn't just choose a place, he chose a force multiplier, one that didn't need orders, didn't need rest, one that punished size, movement, and delay without lifting a blade. And Persia, for all its might, it fought uphill. Against the land, against the heat, against the weight of a place that had already been claimed. The irony? The terrain that Xerxes believed would slow him for hours, slowed him for days. The weather he thought would be a nuisance became part of his defeat. Because when you underestimate the ground beneath your feet, it doesn't forgive. It remembers. It resists. It reclaims. Thermopylae wasn't held by Spartans alone. That's a truth often overlooked, blurred by legend, overshadowed by the iconic 300. But at that pass, in that furnace of dust and death, stood more than just warriors from Lacedaemon. There were Thespians, Thebans, men from across the Greek world, each bringing their own reasons, their own loyalties, some driven by duty, others by desperation, but together they stood, shoulder to shoulder, under one sky, against one storm. And that unity? It wasn't natural. Greece at the time was not one country. It was a mosaic of city-states, often at odds, sometimes at war. To expect them to move as one was like asking the sea to flow in a straight line. But Leonidas knew something about cohesion that Persia couldn't match. He knew how to lead by example, not decree. The Spartans, for all their austerity, understood presence. They didn't just command, they carried themselves like walls of flesh and bronze. And when you saw a Spartan stand unmoved, it demanded respect, even from former rivals. That's how unity is forged, not in treaties, but in trenches. But unity doesn't erase difference. The Thebans weren't less eager. Their loyalty wavered. The Thespians, on the other hand, stayed willingly to the bitter end. Each contingent brought with it a different spirit, a different rhythm. And yet in the fire of the fight, those rhythms found harmony. Why? Because war strips away excess. When the arrows fall and the blades clash, names and cities fade. What remains is the man next to you, his shield, his breath, his will. And when those things align, even briefly, something extraordinary happens. They stop being many. They become one. That coalition at Thermopylae wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it worked because it was built in the moment, not in debate halls, but in the dirt. And Persia had the opposite problem. Its army was massive, diverse, drawn from every corner of the empire. Indians, Egyptians, Medes, Babylonians, each with their own languages, weapons, traditions. Impressive on parade, but cohesion? That's harder to drill into an army that doesn't share a common cause beyond fear or order. Fear doesn't bind, it pressures. And that pressure cracked. Because when facing an enemy united by belief, by choice, not coercion, doubt spreads faster. The Greeks may have been fewer, but they were bound by something far more powerful than numbers: shared intent. Beaver said, "A united front is a psychological weapon." At Thermopylae, it was more than a weapon. It was armor. You could see it in the way they rotated their lines, supported the wounded, held formation in the face of fire. That's not just training, that's trust. And trust, once tested, either dissolves or hardens. Theirs hardened, and what it showed the rest of Greece was simple yet revolutionary. Unity wasn't a dream, it was a choice. And if it could happen in that narrow pass, if men from rival cities could die together, could believe together, then perhaps Greece didn't need to fall. Perhaps it could rise. Thermopylae was not just a battle, it was a glimpse of what could be. And for a fractured land standing at the edge of annihilation, that glimpse meant everything. So, what was left? Not the bodies. Time took those. Not the spears either. Rusted, lost to the earth. What survived was the echo. An echo that still pulses through military academies, through strategy manuals, through every lesson that teaches us this: to resist, even in the face of the inevitable, is in itself a kind of victory. Thermopylae wasn't just a fight, it was a turning point in how we understand power. A moment that proved overwhelming numbers can crumble against conviction, that imperial dominance can falter in the face of conscious courage. Leonidas wasn't trying to stop an invasion, he was shaping a legend, and he did. Because every second the Spartans held that pass bought time for Athens to ready its fleet. Every inch Persia advanced cost them morale, supplies, and prestige. Every breath a warrior drew in that narrow choke point echoed in decisions made days later, in victories only made possible because someone chose to stand, knowing they wouldn't return. Clausewitz reminded us, war is the continuation of politics by other means. But Leonidas proved something else, that sometimes war is a statement, a defiant cry, not here. And you? Would you have stayed? Would you have planted your feet in the dirt even as death crept behind you? Or would you have turned back thinking it was just another lost battle? That is the question Thermopylae still asks, not of empires, but of us. And in the next episode, we'll cross the Aegean Sea to discover what happens when the tide turns and Athens begins to dictate the rhythm of war.